Hi guys, in this video I want to do a follow-up on the equipment schedule component video I put out about a week ago and do a part 2. And in this video I want to go over how you can go about adding events to your dynamic equipment schedule, namely through the database. I'm going to talk about 2 different ways you could do it and the way that I prefer doing it. I'll talk about all of that, but I just want to show you a quick example of what we'll have by the end of this video. So it's nothing impressive, but it is kind of a complete walkthrough. It's a pretty trivial example, and I have a lot of the validation steps and try excepts or whatever else you might have missing, but I'll leave that up to you to add. I'll just do a really quick demo. So this button we added last time launches a form, and on this form we can add an asset. Event. Okay, I'm going to select line 2 for example, or let me select line 1, and then I'll schedule it for the 21st. For the 21st, I don't like that it closes like that, but 7 a.m. Let's go to like 12 p.m. Something like this, 12 p.m. And then I'll hit this button, add event, and it'll add that event here and populate and refresh this component. So that's about it. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is to remind you what I talked about in the last video. There's more than one way to add schedule events to the equipment schedule component in perspective. So in this video I want to kind of show the 2 ways that I can think of, at least the 2 general ways that I can think of, and then go through an example of my preferred method. So for the first way, since I'm not going to implement it all the way, I'll just show kind of an outline of how you would go about implementing adding components this way. And this is of course not a complete example, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But if you Google the equipment schedule scripting page, or just the equipment schedule component in the new Ignition docs, I thought this information was missing, but I actually found it. So but it was definitely present in the old docs, and it's the same thing here. There's this example here under the on add event scripting example. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to show you 2 ways you can hook into the equipment schedule component. Hook, I say in quotes, because one of the ways is not really a hook. So let's open this view that I was using last time. The first way you can hook into the equipment schedule component. I'm saying hook very loosely here, but one of the actions or the events that you can use to do this is the equipment schedules component event. So if you go to configure details, you could see here I already pasted it in. I recorded this video somewhat already, and then at 27 minutes my camera died, so I'm redoing it. So this is basically what I copied and what I pasted in exactly like this last time. And since it's not a complete example in that this doesn't actually add anything to the database, which we would need for our equipment schedule component to continue to be dynamic. Right now this just adds it to the component itself. So whenever you refresh the session, anything you add in that session, it will be deleted. But this is the first way that you can use this component event and capture. So if you look at event here, it's an object. If we just type in event, and we'll get autocomplete. We have event end and start, and then the item ID. So this gives us the 3 main components that we need to insert into the asset schedule or asset event table. We'll review the database structure here in a little bit, but you see that we have the 3 main things, 3 main variables, not things. So we have end, start, and item date. I'll show you where those come from. So if you first add that, of course, like I did, add this to on add event to your component event. And then if you go into your equipment schedule and hold and drag, you'll see that you get an event here. And basically what this script is doing is just a kind of an example. Obviously it uses this random library here, and what it randomizes is an event ID. So it gets a random number, a % done, and a lead time, I think. Yeah, so basically to simulate kind of what a scheduled event would look like. And then how it actually appears on this component is by using that component event hook that you use. And then another hook you can see here that also interacts with this component is on move event or on resize event you can capture, because what happens right now when I resize, so you can see this, but it doesn't actually resize in your scheduled events. If you look here, so this is the randomly added one. You can see the rest of these come from my database. And then whenever I refresh this binding, obviously the one I add in my session is going to disappear. So this is not a complete example or complete walkthrough. This just gives you one way to do this, would be to use this on add event, component event. And then in here, you would put your database code, which we'll do through a form that I'll show you later. But you can do the exact same thing here and it'll work just as well. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to use this button here. Let me see if I cleared out the information. Okay, I did. And the idea of this button, it's a very generic type of functionality to have in a perspective view. Not all components have a nice component method like the schedule event component does. For example, a table doesn't have a method that will allow you, I can't speak today. A table doesn't have a method that will allow you to add a row to a table. So you have to add it in a different way. Usually it's by inserting some data into a database and then refreshing the table component to pull that data in, which is exactly what we'll do here. So the idea for this video, the idea is to hook up, so create a form and then insert some form data into the database and then hook up this button so that it opens the form we create, and also refresh the equipment schedule component to pull our new event into this component here. It's pretty simple, but I think it'll be a good example, and it'll also kind of show you how to use this component, especially the items and the scheduled events properties, how to use this component in editing scheduled events, also deleting scheduled events. It'll kind of have the same flow as you have with adding a scheduled event. And this is the second part, probably the last part in this equipment schedule little playlist. It'll be a part 2 unless somebody really wants to see something specific for part 3, then maybe I can work on that. Okay, so let's get started. I'll design a very simple form. In my views here, I'm going to have a pretty messy structure because I only have 2 views and it's a new project. I have a few more ideas for this overall general project, like an asset manager. Maybe I'll do a project from front to back, kind of from A to Z, do a project for like a beginner to follow along that would involve database interactions and stuff. I think that would be helpful for people who are just starting out with Ignition. And then we can also do some more design focused videos in that kind of series. So I think I'm going to work with this asset scheduler, and I also want to do some videos on the perspective tree component with the asset scheduler or asset manager little project. So I think I'll probably use this in the future. But anyway, let me call this form and give it a type of flex container. And then in this form, we'll want to capture a few pieces of information. So let me open Azure Data Studio. If I look at these 2 tables here, I need to change the schema. All right. Okay, so if you look at these 2 tables, the asset table we're not going to touch. This is basically our lines from last video, remember? And the asset event is the table we're going to insert into. So if you look at asset event here, at this table, you'll see that the asset event ID is required. This is a auto incrementing field, so we don't need to specify it. The name is required, start and end date, and then asset ID, and last modified by, last modified on. Those are easy to get, those values. So basically what we'll need is a name, which will show up on the schedule event, and then a start date and an end date and an asset ID. So this will be a very simple form to build. So we basically want to build a form to capture those values. So let me, I don't know what the best way, I'm kind of trying to think as I do this. Let me just create, actually have a column container, and let me create, this view is gonna look, it's gonna look interesting. It'll look pretty bad, but design is not the main focus of this. So inside my first column container, I'm just gonna design one and then copy it over. So I'm going to have a label, and then for my line ID, so that's not my line ID, my asset selector, I'm going to have a drop down just like that, and we'll want to do single selection. This just presets some properties for you. And then we can set this to do auto. That way it just fits just like that. And drop down. All right. So then the other two components, if you remember, so let me just rename this asset. All right. So now let me duplicate this. Deep select, duplicate, duplicate, duplicate. All right. So we'll have actually my first one. So this can be the asset. We can, you can name that label whatever you want. We'll call this the start date. And we can call this alt click. Usually goes right to the component. End date, and then alt click here, and we'll call this name. So just, I think it makes the most sense to put this name first. So we'll call this cflex name. It'll be easier to look for this data when we select it. So that's why I'll name the top level container start date and date. All right. For asset, we have a drop down, which is fine. But for name, we'll want a text field instead of we'll want a text field instead of a drop down. So I just go in here, delete this drop down, and just like that. It's pretty easy. And then for start date, we'll want a date component. I can never remember which one of these. I think it's this one here, date and time. Yeah, we definitely want to display time as well. We'll delete the drop down. So here drop down is 36 pixels. Date time here also set to 36, just so. I don't know why it doesn't default to the same size. Doesn't make sense to me. And I'm kind of I think I might have OCD, so I need to fix that kind of stuff, even though it doesn't really matter. Okay. Again, I'm speeding through this because this is not really the point of this video. So then I'm going to use a handy dandy property that I picked up from the forums called gap. It's basically a margin between your components. So I'll do like 10px, and you can see that there's a gap between each of these containers. And then maybe I'll do a padding. Let me do a padding 20px top and bottom, and then 50px left and right. Something like this. Okay, so we have our basic component, and of course we can't forget, just like I did, we can't forget our commit button. So this will be my flex R flex actions. The R and the C pretty much just denote if it's a column or a row flex container. Here I'll set this to 50 pixels, actually probably less, it's kind of big. I want it to hug the bottom, so I'll do margin top auto, just like that. And then in here I'll add a button, sure, primary button. And then let me select the view and do flex end. This is a very common setup to have a button in the lower right corner, at least in America it is. The only reason I say that is because some other cultures and languages, they read from bottom right, I believe, or is it top right to left? We read from left to right. That's why I said in America. Okay, so what we're going to do on this button is actually insert our form, the data that's going to come from the form component. And I'm not going to do any validation or anything like that. I'm just going to assume that people are going to fill this information in. Okay, we have that set up. Let me save, make sure I don't lose my work. And then now we have a few options that we can do the same thing, basically a few different ways. So on this button click, we can open up our form a few different ways. We can either add it as a doc, we can open a pop-up window. It really doesn't matter how we do it. We can even have a hidden, I've done this as well, we can have a hidden container that will open up, that just changes the display property or changes the size whenever you hit this button. It just kind of depends on the situation, but I think my previous video that I lost, I did a doc, but I think I'll actually do a pop-up window, since then it'll be kind of smaller and the form itself will look better. So that's what I'll do. On this button click, I'll open up my form here. So let me just copy this path. And let me go here, create an event. I'll do on action performed. And you can just add a pop-up here. I usually never use these. I just use a script. Maybe I'll use it here. So form, we don't have any parameters. You'd have parameters if you were editing a schedule event or if you were deleting a schedule event. So that's something that I'll leave up to you to implement. This is kind of the first iteration, or kind of the first thing you would do for the equipment schedule component. So I'll leave the rest up to you. It generates this identifier. I'll probably copy it. I might need it. And then the title can be add asset event, something like this. We want it to show the close icon, to be draggable, resizable, probably not modal. Modal means, actually maybe it's background dismissible that I was thinking. But I think these two properties are somewhat linked. So I'm just going to leave both of them off, but we don't want it to be background dismissible because you can accidentally click off your form and then lose all the data inside of your form that you've already filled out. So let me just do like a 600 by, or maybe let's do like 800 by 600. All right, so let me just copy this again, make sure I copied it. And if we save this, let me make sure I have a page, launch this URL. Of course, my trial is expired. Okay, and now if we hit this button, we get our very boring form. Okay, so it's coming along pretty nicely. The next thing we'll have to do is, let me actually go back in the designer since I'm already here. Let me just rename this text and the button. I'll call this add event, something like that. Actually, maybe I'll just set a static size like this, and then this would be a button just like this. So now I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. I'm going to create a named query. We'll have to create a named query. We'll also use an existing named query. specifically for this asset dropdown. So what the idea for this component, for the dropdown component, is you would have your options here of the different assets to schedule to. Remember, assets for us mean this line 1 and line 2 we created earlier. So let me just set up this binding here. So if we bind to a query, we'll bind to this get assets query, and we'll do JSON here just like this. If you hit OK or apply here, you're actually going to get a component error, and the reason is because this component expects a value and a label key per object. I mean, you can have other things like this is disabled. This is a newer property, but you can also have other data you add in here, but you need at the very least a value and a label. Like you can see if I call this value and label and then just rename this to value, you see that I don't have the component error, and then I see my two assets there. So now we have to just, we can either rename it here, but we're already using this query elsewhere. So what we can do is just do a script transform. In this case, we only have 2 assets right now, and we're not going to have that many. Even if we have 100 at some point, that's still not a lot of data to transform. So now I'll try to do a fancy Python thing, lambda. If I can even remember, I might edit this out. We'll see if I can remember how to do this. Just like this, and then inside here, I'm going to call, so for each of my objects, this is basically for each of my objects here in this preview, in this iterator, which in this case is a list, for each of them I'm going to transform to something else. So right now it's called an ID. It's called ID, that's coming from the database, and we want to transform it to value. So we'll just do this value, and then we'll get the ID that's coming from the database. So when it needs to be called value, remember. And then also we have label, so we need at least 2 components here, or 2 keys for the dropdown component, and then this is already called label, and then we can add something else just to show you. We can add like a description. Actually, having more data here will not hurt at all. So we could just add all of these keys, and then we can, for example, I just want to demonstrate a point. So now you can see that I have both my label and value properties, just like it expects here. But I can also add some other data here. It doesn't get in the way of the component working. So now if we click here, we have line 1 and line 2. Another important fact is that these values, value 1 and value 2, are the primary keys for the assets here, 1 and 2. This is important when we're going to be inserting into the database. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, now that we set up this, again, don't get too caught up here on this map. It took me a while to figure out how to use this. You can just do a for loop and do the same thing. Again, this is not the point of the video. I'm not going to focus on it too much to not take away from the main point of this video. Okay, now in our named queries, the other query that I said we'll need to add is add asset event. So we'll need to actually have a query that will insert something into our database. So let me set this up. This is another trick. Actually, it's not really a trick because it's going to scream at you whenever you're inserting something and not returning. So unless it's a procedure, you most likely will not be returning something. There's this update query type that you need to set it to. Query expects a data set, a result data set. Update query is the one that you use usually for inserting into the database. So you'll have to select that, and then so our parameters, if you remember, we have a name, we have a start, or actually since our data type is set to int4 here, I'll just call this asset ID. Then we'll add two more here. We'll call them start date and end date. And then we'll change the data type. This is important. The JDBC driver is gonna yell at us if we don't do this. And now we write our query. So in here we'll do insert into TWP is the schema, and then our table is called asset event, and then the values we want to insert. If you look here, so let me actually open the database here. Asset event, we will insert a name. So this column here gets dynamically generated. It's like auto increment, that's what it's called in MySQL. We'll insert a name, start date, end date, and asset ID, and then these two columns we will also insert here. So if we do name, start date, end date, asset ID, last modified by, last modified on, and then we'll want to insert these values. So we'll want to insert, actually there's one more parameter here. We'll call it username of type string that we'll pass into this query. So then we'll want to insert here. You can't just click this. This is a trick. I don't like using this trick because it adds a leading and following space. So I just use a colon, name. So you have to follow this order here. So even though it's name and asset ID here it's name, start date. So obviously you want to follow that order. Start date, end date, at asset ID, username, and then we'll use the get date function. I think it's a SQL function. Yeah, that should work. So now, just to test this out, we'll go in here and we'll add a new event. We'll call it ignition test. The asset ID here, we have 1 and 2. I'll just select 2. Here, oh, this is kind of nice. I've never seen this before. So our start date we'll set to 26th. We'll just set it to now. And then the end date, wow, this is actually super nice. We'll set it to 3 hours from now. And then username, we'll just call admin. Okay, now we try inserting, and it says there is no invalid object name, TWP, asset event. Let me look here what I called it. Oh, WMS, duh. So let me go here, WMS. And now when I execute query, the result of 1 usually means that it inserted successfully. And just to verify this, we'll go back into the database and we can see that we have our event here. And it also, coincidentally, since it's stored in the database, if we refresh here, so let me actually select like the 27th and then scroll over. You should see our event somewhere here. Let me refresh this. Refresh the binding. Sorry about this. Let me go back here and our event should be here. Okay, it's pretty much exactly what we want to do, except now we want to insert it through our form. So I will copy this named query name here, add asset event, copy this, copy path. I'll also take a snip here of my parameters just because you need to capitalize them correctly or else it's not going to work. Okay, so now let me go back into this form view and I'll add a very simple script here on action performed. Again, I'm not going to verify that all the fields are filled out, for example, even though these are required fields. So in the real world, you'd want to do something like that. So here, I'll just browse to the text field, text property. Again, this is not the best, it's not really a best practice usually. Usually, how I understand it at least, you would want to go to either the view or the root container and create custom properties that you would then bind these components to. And then in your event, you would access the root or the view custom property. But here, I'm not going to worry about that. So I'll do start date is equal to start date here, value, end date, same thing. The nice thing about naming your containers, at least at the high level, is then you know there's no ambiguity. Asset ID, we'll want to get it from the asset drop down, so props value, and then username. Username is a session property. If you go to session props, user or auth user username, here it is. And then now, actually username would probably be null because this is a public project. To save some time, I'm just gonna set the username to something that's hard-coded because this is a public project and I would want to go through the steps that it will take to set up a user source. So I'm just gonna hard code this, but obviously in the real world, you do something like this. So I'll just set this to admin. And then now we can set up, so system.db.run named query. I just had a brain fart, forgot what that function was called. And now we will go here, copy this, copy path, just like this, go back here, and our path is called add asset event. That's our named query. And then params. Params will be something we define here. And now our snip comes in handy that I'll have off to the side here. You can see all my names. So I need to have a name, and we'll set it to name. So this reference is this. This is mapped to my name query parameter. And then start date. And just like the rest of them here. So let me just crank this out. Asset ID, I think I called. So this order here that you put them in doesn't really need to match either of these. So the database order, the parameter order, you can put them in any order you want, as far as I know anyway. I've never run into an issue there. So username, since it's a dictionary or it's like an object, these aren't inherently sorted anyway or in order. Okay, username, and then we'll just set it to username here. Another confusing thing about run named query is that if you want to name the parameters or this params, it's actually called parameters. Like that caught me a few times. If I go, let's actually see how good this search is. Named query, oh, pretty good. So the property is actually called parameters instead of params. Other places like system, perspective, open pop-up, it'll be called params. Everywhere else is called params. Here it's called parameters. So just be careful, be mindful of that because it burned me a few times. Okay, just like that. That's all we want to do. And then, I mean, you can throw it into a try-catch clause if you want a little, if you want it to log an exception. All right, so first we'll run this in the designer, and then if it runs in the designer fine, we will run it in a session. We have one more step to do actually before in scripting before we're done with this little project. But first, before we do that, let's just add a test event here. My camera memory filled up as I was recording this. That's why there's stuff pre-selected here. So I initiated a move from my SD card to my hard drive, went to the gym, and now I'm back. Okay, so hopefully this still makes sense to me and I remember what I was doing. We'll enter a name, just another test event here. Select one of our assets, line 1 or line 2. This is coming from the wms.asset table. And then we'll select a start date, the 26th is today. Let's do the 27th at 12 a.m. And then the end date will be the 27th at 6 a.m. Sure, it would be a 6-hour event. Okay, now let's open a console. I'm gonna clear this. That way if we get an issue, we can view it right away. Okay, there's nothing in the console. So I'm gonna assume that it inserted successfully, and then I'll go here. Let me run this, and then you could see my other test event that I just added. Okay, now that that's fine, let me actually clear these fields to make sure that it doesn't save in my session and then pre-fill. Actually, let me set this to not persist. I think this is what this setting is for, not persist. I've never tried doing it this way. Usually I just clear it out. This might be the better way to do this, not persist. And then if I add something in here, okay, then if I save it in my session, it shouldn't save it. Let me, of course, reset my trial. Okay, just like that. And now if I go here, yeah, see, it doesn't save it, which is what we want. Okay, perfect. Okay, the last thing I was gonna say that we need to do is we need to refresh our equipment schedule component. Remember when I added an item in the database and then I had to go in here and just hit the OK, which will refresh you see how this popped up here? And then if we go to the 27th, let's actually go 28th, and then you'll see our new item here, another test event. Okay, so I had to refresh that manually, but of course we want a way to do it through scripting. So what I'm gonna do is go to the equipment schedule component here and hit configure scripts. And what we're gonna do is add a message handler that's gonna accept a message from the page scope is fine, because a view scope wouldn't work because we have two views here. We have a pop-up view and this primary view. View scope is almost unnecessary, I feel like, because if it's scoped to the view, then just use a custom method. So view scope is unnecessary unless you have like a message handler that does many things. For example, you can have one message handler called refresh, and then you put that message handler on several components, and then when you call it from one system perspective send message call and pass in refresh, it will refresh like 10 components at once. So maybe that's a use case, but for us, the page scope will be fine. We don't need to do a session scope, and all we'll call this is refresh events or something like this. And then what this will do, since it's already scoped to the equipment schedule component, it doesn't necessarily need to be. We could put it on the root container, but I'll just put it here, and then we'll go to what we want to refresh is our schedule events here. So this is how I like to do it. I just browse to whatever property like this. Browse to whatever property we want to refresh, and then I just add refresh binding. And good thing I added this as well, because if we add another line 3, for example, we also want that to refresh. So I'm just going to refresh both of these properties at once, just like this. There we go. When we hit apply, you can see that my refresh event message here, we don't have any payload or anything like that. This is a very simple message. But let's hit OK here, and then on the form view, when we add an event, at the very end, let's just say, let's send the message, send message to equipment review, just like this, and then we'll call system.perspective.send message, just like this, and then we'll call it this, and then the scope defaults to page, so we have no payload, so this should be fine, just calling it like this. Then the last thing we'll do is I don't know why I commented this out, system.perspective.close popup, and then I could just do this and it'll close the current pop-up. But the safer way to do it is to actually get the ID of the pop-up, so we'll go back here and get the pop-up ID. This will be the better way to do it. So we'll just pass that in here, just like this, and hit OK. So now when we save, let's go test this one last time. Now we can hit this view. Let's enter a name. Last test. And let's put it on line 2. And I want to put it on the 18th at 12 p.m., 12 to 4. That way when it refreshes, we can see it without scrolling. So let's put it on the 18th from 12 p.m. to 18th. Let's just go like 8 p.m. just like this, and then let's hit add event. There we go. You see it did 2 actions there at the end, so it added it to the database, and now we can refresh this as much as we want. We'll open another session, and those events will be there. So okay, the last thing I'll do is that could be helpful here is I'll add another button. So let me actually just duplicate this, copy, deep select, and paste here. And this button will, this will be a refresh button. Another thing that's very common, like this, and this icon, let's just set it to like a reset, I think it's called. This guy, refresh, I guess. And then here we can, instead of doing this, we can, I don't know if there's a send message here. I don't think so. Okay, let's just system.perspective.send message refresh events. Just like that. Okay, let me double check and make sure I called it the same thing. A refresh event. It almost makes sense to call it refresh events. So let me change this really quickly. Change this here. And notice if my send message were to fail, it wouldn't close the pop-up. So that would give you a hint that something went wrong. But of course you want to have proper validation in the real world. And now when we refresh, so like we can move this. See, it refreshes on its own. So yeah, we can add something in through the database, and then we hit this refresh button, it'll pull it in here. That's all that I wanted to show. Hopefully that's helpful. We covered a few useful topics here, so hopefully it's helpful just beyond this component. But if you want to see something else for the equipment schedule component, or just anything we covered in general, just leave me a comment or hit me up on Discord. I try to stay pretty active on there now that I have a little more time. But besides that, yeah, thank you for watching. I will see you soon in the next video.